Thank you, Boris, for this kind introduction, and also thank you very much for organizing this conference. Thank you. I will indeed talk about more physical activity and less sitting in children. Why is it necessary, and how can we do this? Of course, the first part is quite easy. Why? Especially for this audience, because I think everybody here is convinced that we need to promote more physical activity and less sitting in children. But I just want to go over some state-of-the-art findings and go into some of the arguments we can use and should use to have our policymakers being convinced that we do need to promote more physical activity and less sitting in children. The second part is a more difficult part. I will focus on how can we do this, and then I will come to some conclusions. So first of all, why do we need to promote more physical activity and less sitting in children? If I go into the literature and look into the rationale that people use to bring up these arguments, then I mostly see these different arguments. It is important because it has an impact on bone density. Promoting physical activity and less sitting is important because it tracks, these behaviors track from childhood into a later age, because it is linked to a healthy weight and linked to motor development. Another argument, which I don't see very often, is academic achievement, and I also want to say a few words on this argument. So first of all, bone density. Already in 1972, Charles Dent pointed out that senile osteoporosis is a pediatric disease, pointing out that bone mineral content at young age is a critical factor for bone health at the older age. Especially with our aging society, this is of course a very important argument. And quite recently, this longitudinal study was done by Lappe et al., which looked into the longitudinal effects of physical activity and dietary calcium intake on bone mass accrual across the stages of pubertal development. In this study, which was a large study including over 2,000 children, and looking at an evaluation over 6 years, they looked at bone mineral content, calcium intake, and physical activity. And as was found in previous study, again, it was very strongly confirmed that children who do more physical activity have better bone mineral content, have a better bone health, even after adjustment for calcium intake, which was quite different compared to some previous studies, is that in this study there was no differential effect according to maturational stage. So this physical activity, and especially the weight-bearing activities, are not only important during phases of rapid growth, but during the entire childhood, and also already in very young children, as young as 5 to 6 years old, we do see that it does predict bone health at much later age. Okay, what about tracking? Tracking is important, and this was already pointed out by Blair in 1989. We see that childhood activity is related to adult activity and directly and indirectly related to adult health, because it does track, the behavior tracks. And recently, a study was done on the Young Finns study in Finland regarding tracking of physical activity from early childhood through youth into adulthood. This study included about 3,600 children, 3 to 18 years old, and followed them for 27 years. And it was very clearly shown that physical activity as young as at age 3 and 6 predicts physical activity in youth and in young adulthood. So Talama pointed out that physically active lifestyle starts to develop very early in childhood, and that the stability of physical activity, not only of physical inactivity, which has been shown stronger in the past, but also physical activity itself, is moderate to high from youth to adulthood. If we talk about tracking, I also looked at some very specific behaviors. And this is an example of a specific behavior we looked at in one of our studies. We looked at the tracking of bicycling to school. So we included 10-year-old children about 1,600, and followed them for 6 years. And of course, what we found is that the prevalence of biking to school in children increases when children age, because they do get more independent mobility. So it raised from 30% at age 10 to 60% at age 16. But more important in this regard is that even cycling at age 10 predicted cycling to school at age 16. So also for some specific behaviors, we see that starting at a young age is really important. What about healthy weight? I think it's very clear that physical activity and also sitting are energy balance behaviors. So the link between these behaviors and healthy weight is very strong. But we recently hear that obesity rates and rates of overweight are stabilizing. So let's look into some data, some recent data in children on the prevalence of overweight and obesity. Is it still necessary? And as you see here, the prevalence rates are still quite high. These are data from the Energy Project in 10 to 12-year-old children. So you see that in the Netherlands, Belgium, Norway, the prevalence rates of overweight and obesity are about 15%. So about 1 out of 6 children has overweight at this age. And when you go more to the south, like Spain, Slovenia, and Hungary, it's like 1 out of 4 of the children, and Greece, almost 1/2 of the children has overweight. So it's still a very high prevalence of overweight and obesity. What about even younger children? So these are data from the Toy Box study in 4 to 7-year-old children. And actually we see a little bit of the same gradient. We indeed also see here that in the more northern countries, prevalences are somewhat lower, but still quite problematic, with about 13% of the 4 to 7-year-old being overweight. And in the south, it's even worse, like 1 out of 3 of the children being overweight. Motor development. I've decided not to say much about motor development because you will have many more presentations on this. But if we talk about motor development and the link with physical activity, what always comes up is the cross-sectional problem. What's first? Are children that have better motor skills more physically active, or is their motor development better because they're more active? And there have been quite some studies which prove both directions. And I want to refer to this very nice figure of David Studden, and I've seen that David Studden is in the room, so anyone who has problems or questions on this figure can of course ask him. But the main thing for me is that we can clearly see that motor competence and physical activity do relate to each other in both directions. So really we see that more active children do develop better motor skills, but it is also the other way around. Academic achievement. It's in parentheses because if you look at the literature on physical activity in children, you don't very often see it as a rationale, as an argument to promote physical activity. And actually, I also don't think it should be, because I don't think it's a shame that it's not enough to just have the other arguments. It's a shame, but what we do see is if we do really want to convince policymakers, if we really do want to convince the boards of school, it is a very important argument. We do see that people are much more sensitive to academic achievement, and as I say, it's really a shame, but it's a case compared to the health arguments. And actually there have been some studies recently that clearly show that children who are more active and sit less have better academic achievement, have better executive functioning. So I would suggest to take this argument along, and if you do studies, also look into this, because it is a very strong argument in our society especially for policymakers. So as an advocacy tool, it's really important that we also take this academic achievement along, especially because we clearly see that there is a link between physical activity and academic achievement. Okay, so far I've mainly talked on physical activity, and I will mainly focus on this, but I just want to say a few words that I will also take sedentary behavior along. And when I'm talking about sedentary behavior, I'm not talking about inactivity. I'm not talking about not enough physical activity, but I'm really talking about sitting. Like watching TV, sitting in the classroom, watching on the computer, or sitting, playing on the computer, or sitting while gaming. Really sitting behavior. And the evidence is growing that sitting behavior, sedentary behavior, even independent from physical activity, is linked to some health outcomes. This is a recent review which was done by Rezende, which showed that sitting behavior, independent from physical activity, is strongly linked with obesity, and there's also moderate evidence that it is linked with blood pressure, cholesterol, self-esteem, social behavior problems, physical fitness, and academic achievement. So it's really important, and the evidence is growing, that we also need to focus on sedentary behavior independent from physical activity. Okay, so on one hand, we know there is a strong link with physical activity and sedentary behavior and some health outcomes, but if we really want to prove that we need to work on the behaviors, it's also important to see how active or inactive and how sedentary the children are at this time. Before looking into this, I want to show a few slides on how these days we do measure their behavior. And there's different ways we can measure this behavior in young children. We've been using pedometers, accelerometers, which can also look at the intensity of the physical activity. And we've done some validation studies which show that both measurements are quite nicely linked. So also pedometer is a valid way of picturing the physical activity level of children. We've also been using more detailed objective measurements like pedometers, which can also distinguish for certain time frames. So you can really look at physical activity right before school, after school, which is also important in the scope of developing interventions. Some measurement instrument like the active PAL, which is a more expensive instrument, is able to distinguish between the postures. So with the active PAL, we can clearly show how much the children are sitting during the day. Some objective observations in the classroom are also very helpful. And of course, we're still using questionnaires, especially in large samples. I think questionnaires are still very useful. And from the age of 10, we can use questionnaires in a valid way, and it does give you very nice information specifically on certain contexts of physical activity, like active transport to school or physical activity during certain moments and so on. We've also seen that also the physical activity questionnaire, for example, this one we used in 10 to 12-year-old children, was a little bit more valid if we have the parents assist the children when filling out the questionnaire. Anyway, based on all the different measurements, and there are some differences, but based on all the different measurements, we can come to some conclusions on the physical activity levels. And in the measurements, there's still some issues to be solved. We still argue between the cut points that we should use of accelerometers, and do we have to use active PALs, or can we use accelerometers for sedentary behavior and so on. But I think in the end, they all come to the same conclusion, that a large part of the children are not active enough, no matter which measurement instrument we do use. Just some recent data on their physical activity levels and sedentary behavior levels. These are data from the Energy Project in different countries in Europe. Belgium, Greece, Hungary, the Netherlands, and Switzerland. And you can see overall that the average physical activity level, meaning moderate to vigorous physical activity per day, is a little bit over half an hour, while we know that the guideline is that children have to be at least 1 hour active at moderate to vigorous physical activity. Switzerland does a little bit better, but based on this figure, you can still see that a large percentage of the children is not reaching the physical activity recommendations. Regarding sedentary behavior, we see that the 10-year-olds are sitting about 8 hours a day in the different countries. Also some data on some younger studies. These are data from the Toy Box study. And in the 3 to 5-year-olds, we can see that they take, we used pedometers here, so they take about 10,000 steps per day. And if you do translate the physical activity guideline of preschoolers, which is 3 hours of physical activity from light to vigorous per day, into step counts, it means that they should take about 13 to 15,000 steps a day. So it's really below the recommendation. And during the weekend, we see they do even a little bit worse. Sedentary time in preschoolers, we mainly looked at TV viewing, and as you can see, even at preschool age, children watch TV during the weekday for about 1 hour a day, and during the weekend about 2 hours a day, which is really high for these young children. Only Germany did much better. We're not completely sure why, but apparently it is really a cultural thing, because these are very large sample, over 1,000 children from each country, so we can say they are representative, and you can see that we did find some country differences specifically for Germany. And apparently computer use in the preschoolers is not so prevalent. So when we talk about interventions, we should mainly focus on TV viewing in the preschoolers rather than computer use. And these are some data from my colleague Jo Salmon from Deakin University. And she did a review of TV viewing in young children. And as you can see, it's also in even very young children, very prevalent. So 3 to 12-month-old children watch 1 hour TV per day. Infants, a little bit less, 1 to 2 years, 1.5 years. So even these very, very young children, we see they do watch about an hour a day. And it seems to be internationally the case. So I think we're quite convinced that we do need to promote more physical activity and less sitting in children, because it's so related to health. And we do see that many children do not reach the physical activity guidelines. So this brings me to the second part. How can we do this? And this is, of course, the much more difficult part. The importance of the socio-ecological model has really grown in public health promotion, and I think also in the promotion of physical activity and less sitting in children, it's really important. And it's a guidance that we can use if we think of interventions to promote physical activity and less sitting. According to this model, we do need to work on the different levels. So it is important to teach our children that moving, physical activity is important. It is important that we also involve the parents, that we do involve the schools, that also policy is involved, and that we have nice environments for the children to play. This socio-ecological model has also been put forward by Metala and Arya Sakslati and her co-workers, who did a review on this approach to physical activity intervention in childcare, so a very young age group. And they found that the results from the interventions were really modest, and they really did put forward that if we want to really change the behavior, we have to come up with multi-component interventions. And this model, looking at the different levels, seems the way to go forward. Another quite good document which really also reflects on the socio-ecological model and in which we can see that the different components are included is the Toronto Charter. The Toronto Charter was reported in 2010 and they did put forward the 7 best investments for physical activity. And these are the investments they put forward that work for physical activity. Whole of school programs, so having the schools involved and not only physical education but whole of school programs. Looking into transport policy, urban design is important. Also the integration into the healthcare system. Public education stays important. Also for sedentary behavior, it's really important and we still need to change some social norms on sedentary behavior. We need community-wide programs. Like the minister just pointed out a very good point. We really need to have the community work together with the schools, like opening the accommodation for the clubs and so on. And we need to have programs that promote sports for all. So these are is a really good summary of investments that do work for the promotion of physical activity. If we look at this whole of school component, we looked at it specifically in elementary schools in Flanders, and we asked 241 schools in which degree they implemented these components. Because if you translate the whole of school component or whole of school approach, these components seem important. It is important that they have at least once a week PE, that physical activity is not only approached in PE but also in some other subjects, that sports fields and materials are available, that you have some organized sports and physical activity, that active transport is promoted, and that there's organized sports or physical activity after school. And in Flanders, we did find that those first components scored quite well. So all the schools have PE because it's mandatory. And the other components were well prevalent. But the promotion of active transport and organized after-school sport was organized by less than half of the schools. And it's really a missed opportunity. First of all, if we, for example, look at the promotion of active transport, if you can imagine that a child lives 15 minutes biking from school or 15 minutes walking, and it does it twice a day, it's already half of the recommendation. So it's really an important contribution to physical activity if we can have our children going to school in an active way. Some ways to promote physical activity. What is important? If we look at the determinants, the main thing that comes up is safety and distance. So schools really have to put effort in having the children be able to come to school in an active way and a safe way by organizing maybe walking pools, biking pools where children go under supervision to the school. Also by working on the motor skills, specifically the biking skills of children, which show to be an effective way. Also working together with the community and maybe the police to have a safe environment around the school. A small thing but seems very important is to have safe bike racks at the school. So all these things can contribute to the promotion of active transport to the school. However, as I told you, distance is an important issue. And therefore, we also did an experiment to promote physical activity or active transport to the school for those children who live further away from the schools, making use of drop-off spots. So the idea is that we had some locations within a feasible walking distance from the school where parents can drop off or pick up their child, and from there the children walk to the school under supervision. And we have some data on this which are quite positive, and it seems to be a feasible and a accepted strategy for those children. But if you want to hear more about this, Griet van Wollegem from our group will present this later today. So these are some results from this kind of intervention but you can hear about this later on. Okay, organized after-school sports. We see that only 1 out of 3 schools did organize after-school sports in Flanders, according to this survey. And actually, it is also a very good way of reaching children that do not immediately find a way to a sports club, because the barrier to go to a sports club is much higher than being involved in after-school sports. And these are some data from Anne de Meester, who looked at the participation of the children in elementary school and secondary school in school sports, after-school sports, in case it was organized, of course, in the school. And what we can see that in elementary school, the participation was quite high, with about 3/4 of the children participating or having participated in the previous year, while in secondary school, 3/4 is not participating. And that's something we very often see, that there is really a drop out of the after-school sports from elementary school to secondary school. So really an important point to work on. And this is really a missed opportunity, because also in secondary school, the after-school sports can reach a lot of students, a lot of youngsters, which are very often not the most talented ones and do not find the way towards the sports clubs. If we talk about physical activity promotion in the schools, of course, also really important are the recess periods, the free play of the children. So we also did some studies, and there are quite some studies in the literature who looked at physical activity levels during recess. And what came out of these studies is one of the main factors for the activity levels is the density. We did see when there's a higher density, so when there's more children in a smaller place, the physical activity levels really go down. So it is important to have enough play space during recess periods. Another factor was the supervision. We did see when there was more supervision that physical activities were lower, because very often the preschool teachers or the teachers in elementary school were just sitting down because they consider this as a break, and the children are gathering around them and they stay inactive. So an activating approach from the teachers would be helpful. So based on these findings, we do advise schools to use all the available space that they do have, because very often you see schools where they still have grass fields which are not used, especially when it's wet. They just have the children playing in this small space while there's so much space left. So this is really a very simple advice, but important advice that can really help increasing physical activity in children. Another way we try to increase the play space for the children, and we tried it in preschoolers and also in elementary school children, is just by splitting up the children, having a couple of classes play, for example, from 10 to 10:15, and then the other class 15 minutes later, so that they have double space. And of course, there are some barriers because the classes around are maybe disturbed by some noise and so on, but it does seem to work. Just some very simple interventions on the environment which can help increase physical activity at a quite large level, because you reach a lot of children. When thinking about recess, another way is also trying to improve the playground by putting some markings or giving some specific materials children can use during recess periods. This is something we also tried in elementary school children and in preschool children. And we did find very nice results in elementary school children. We did see in the schools where we provided markings, where we provided balls and hoops and toys during recess, the children were more active. However, in preschoolers, and these are the markings we provided in preschoolers and the toys we provided, this had hardly any effect. And this way I really also want to point out that one intervention, it's not working for everybody. It's very age specific. It's not one size fits all. And something may work in one school, but may not work in another school. So here, for example, you can see it's a quite nice playground. There's lots of space and there's some tools children can play. But apparently the very young ones not automatically always use it. So they might need some extra guiding, some extra playing with them, like maybe some play for the older children who play with the preschoolers in order to activate them. So it's really also age specific. So far I've mainly talked on interventions at the school, but of course promoting physical activity and promoting less sitting is a shared responsibility. It's not only the school, but also the home environment, which is very important. However, if we look at which is a good environment to promote physical activity in children, then we do have some problems for urban planners, because it's quite different from an inviting environment for adults. If we look at adults, we see that they are more active when they live in a neighborhood with high connectivity, a very walkable neighborhood, a mix of stores and houses, many crossroads, a high population density. That's where adults are very active. But for children, it's quite opposite. Children are more active when you have dead-end streets. Safety is, of course, a very important issue. When there's low traffic, when you have yards, when you have playgrounds. So actually a very different environment. And therefore very challenging for urban planners to come up with a neighborhood which is inviting for physical activity in both age groups. And therefore we need to be creative. We need to think of good ways to approach the different age groups. And this is, I think, an example of a creative way. Having dead-end streets which also give access to cyclists and walkers for connectivity. So this is an example of a street which will invite adults, but also children to be active. Another example of a creative way of coping with the different environments for physical activity or inviting physical activity is the concept of play streets. And maybe some of you are not familiar with this concept, but it means that a certain street in a city or in a residential area is reserved for children to play outside. So the street is blocked for cars at certain times. For example, during summer holiday, it is blocked during the week from 2 to 7 in the afternoon. So this is a project we do have in Flanders, and maybe some other countries have it. And the inhabitants of the street can just put in a request in the city council, and they can have their street blocked so the children can play outside while they live in an area which is normally not safe to play in. And we did some studies on the physical activity levels. We did see that this concept of a play street resulted in more physical activity during the play street and also in less sitting in the children. Okay, just some other environments to point out that indeed an environment that does create a safe neighborhood where children can play is really important. So not really the best place to play, or this is up, but it's the reality. These are things that you do see in the street. Also not really the best one. And this picture was not taken in Belgium, as you can see, but also not really a great environment. The next picture I took myself last summer, and actually this is a picture I took on the beach of Santa Cruz last July, And when I walked by, I was like, wow, this is really saying something about the socio-ecological model. Because here you do have a great environment to play. And you do have parents that probably really love their children because they don't want them to happen anything. They really don't want that, they really protect them from the sun. Dad is even bringing water into the cage. So actually it's all there, but something is missing. And probably it's the fact that these parents are not really aware of the fact how important it is to have their children explore, or maybe they don't have the parenting skills to cope with a couple of children running around, to keep them in a safe environment. So it tells a lot about the approach we need to use, in my opinion. Okay, I already talked a little bit on the energy project. I showed you some data. Also, in the energy project, an intervention was developed, the Up for Fun intervention. And this intervention works with very nice materials, and it focuses on less sitting. So it really focuses on having more breaks on sitting and doing less sitting in general in children by stickers, bracelets. Parents are involved by newsletters, a family fun event, some quiz, and so on. As you can see, some nice materials. A lot of effort was put into this intervention, and it was really developed from a theoretical framework with focus groups and so on. The effects were very disappointing, very minimal. Also in Toy Box, we did develop an intervention. Again, we did focus groups with parents, with teachers. We had intervention mapping. We put a lot of effort into this intervention. And actually, the intervention focuses on 4 behaviors: physical activity, less sitting, water drinking, and healthy snacking. So here you can see some materials we used. We made sure all the materials were very easy to use for the teachers, very attractive. Because that was one of the comments we did get in the focus group with teachers. They want everything ready to use, so they don't have to put too much effort in it. We asked them to change the environment in the classroom. For example, this station where children, preschoolers can play standing up instead of sitting. However, same thing. We are still analyzing the data, but up to now, we find very minimal results. And that's something I want to approach in my conclusion. First of all, I think if we look at what we've learned from all the different interventions, I think the socio-ecological model, the fact that we do have to look into the individual, but also the parents, the school, and the environment, is an important message, and that's probably the only way we can really make a change. If we look at the environments, it's really important to have some creative thinking. In the environment, for example, this is Primo Sport from Patricia Tartelli in Verona. And this is also a way of combining things. We have to start thinking about how can we combine physical activity with motor skills and so on. In this environment, what happens is it's not only safe and an inviting environment, but it also has developed ways of really working on the different motor skills. So also something that really fits in the socio-ecological approach. And even challenging for adults, which is also always very fun. Another project, Multimove, I want to point out is really a project on structured physical activity, but also focusing on the different components. It's like Sports for All. We really have to stay away from too early, very sports-oriented structured physical activity sessions, but make sure that we can develop the motor skills of the young ones in a very broad range. Nevertheless, while we are creative, we have these environments, like I said, the interventions really on physical activity are rather small. And that's why we need to think about 2 things. What about the implementation and what about the policymakers? First of all, what about the implementation? The Toy Box project, the energy project, very nice things, but we need to put much better effort in looking into the implementation. How well is it implemented? And very often we see, even with our nice materials, the implementation very often lacks. So we need to have much more implementation research. Another thing is, very often what we do is we, researchers, we develop interventions. And yes, we do some focus groups, and yes, we talk with teachers, but it's not them who really come up with interventions. And we do need a much better effort to involve the people that will implement, that need to implement in the development of our intervention. And that's why now the participatory approach is really gaining interest. And in the future, I think if we really want to make a difference, we have to work in a much more participatory way. We have to involve our target group in the entire process. We have to sit down with the school, with the pupils, with the children, to see how we can move forward. And even in our research, we can really have them being involved. So if you're interested, look into participatory approach, and I think we will have much more success. Specifically, we will have a much better implementation if we do work in a more participatory way. Finally, what about policymakers? As I already told you, it's really important in our research that we also do things that can really convince the policymakers, like taking academic achievement along. Well, maybe we think it's not that important. It is important for policymakers, so let's take it along. And another nice feature I want to point out regarding policymakers are the report cards. Report cards are a very strong advocacy tool. And this is an example of the recently released report cards of Scotland. So what the report card does, it just shows for the different behaviors at which level the country is. For example, for a sedentary behavior, they do get an F, meaning that we are succeeding with very few children and adolescents. So actually not a good score. Physical activity, F. Active transportation, C. And Scotland is having very big problems with obesity, very high obesity prevalence. So this kind of report cards are really important for policymakers, are really an advocacy tool. This is a report card from Canada, and so, for example, what it says, how Canada stacks up against 14 other countries in physical activity for children and youth. Ministers don't want their country to be at the bottom of this list, so it's something really strong. And on the website of this report card of Canada, you can also go to the different other countries, and here are some countries that do have report cards. So it would be nice if Belgium would have a report card, and it might be a very strong tool to convince some policymakers or funding agencies for the research on physical activity in children. Finally, I want to thank my entire research group, who did, of course, lots of the work behind all the research I presented. I also want to abuse the opportunity to invite you to the upcoming ISBN-PAM meeting, which will take place in Edinburgh next year in June, and we will have lots of sessions and symposia on physical activity and sedentary behavior in children. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Grit, for this very clear and interesting presentation. We have now a few time for discussion. Is there any questions? Yeah. Est-ce qu'il y a un micro? Oui. On lève la main. Any question here? Yeah, there.
Thank you, Greet. That was a really nice presentation. I fully agree with you about the participatory approach and the idea that one size does not fit all. but how does that kind of stack up against this wide dissemination and a scalable approach?
I think it can be scalable and can be widely disseminated at a certain degree, but in the end, if you really want to have a good implementation, it doesn't work. It has shown so many times, and that's why it's also so difficult with all the European projects. We've seen so many times that it just doesn't work, and we put lots of effort and we put all this money in this intervention development, but if it doesn't work at the end, it really doesn't make sense. So I think it's much better to really start from the target group, and even if it really differs and if the scalability is quite limited, I think it's still more important than really having an intervention. But of course some of the strategies are transferable, and it's really important to learn from each other, but still in the end, if you really want it to be implemented, we need to involve the target group. But it's a good comment. Thank you.